that they are the foundation for good governance. And I think we need to be sensitive to different cultural traditions and understandings in the way people.
You want to predict what the economy will look like.
Right? Like a budget success is we've implemented it, we've said what we're going to do, we reached it on time, we've done exactly what we said we're done.
Welcome to the Civic Policy Archive.
Hi there, my name is Olubunmi Azuji and you're welcome to the Civic Policy Archive yet again. Today, I have Kris Wanner with me. A short background, right? Kris is one of the public service model that I look up to. I've worked with him and I understand that public service and leadership is inbuilt. It's one of the examples that I have. He's the director of we call them PSA, and I would like him to say the full meaning here. So Kris is here, he's been into banking, and now he leads a team, one of the most ingenious team in one of the ministries in the government of Saskatchewan in Canada. So Kris, can we meet you?
Yeah, absolutely. So great intro, thanks Boomy. So I am the director of project support and analytics. So I'm super pumped to have the team that we do. I'm glad to have you on our team, for example, as well. I like that you said that we're, a team that really works hard at advancing other teams. So we reside in the project support office.
Of course.
So our success is the direct success of the project teams delivering the biggest infrastructure projects in the province. So our team is really, as you've heard me say before, I think of us like a startup.
Yes.
We're very lean. We're scrappy. We're working hard to try to make things better for everyone and help inform decisions.
Of course.
Great.
Thank you very much for coming here. So straight into it, right? I'm just going to throw you direct into the water. You transitioned for banking, core level banking, real deep Canadian banking into public service. Now for an average new entrant into the public service, that might be sort of what is the nexus between the private sector, that's banking, and what you now do as regards analytics and forecasting and budgeting for government and all of that? What is the nexus? Why?
Yeah, actually, that's a really great question. So I guess for me, for my background is, you were right about banking. I think the core similarity in the why is I worked for a cooperative. Nexus Credit Union was the name of the company I spent 15 years with. And
over a decade.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. I know. I mean, my hairline gives it away, but yeah, it's cooperatives are very interesting, and I found them, I've always been very drawn to them because they are, significantly different than typical corporations. And so we could talk at length about cooperatives, but I'd sum it up as cooperatives have a social and fiscal responsibility to the communities that they live in and that they give back to. So much so that they have it mandated within the operation of a cooperative. And so where I think you said the nexus, which I really like, is it's that component where we previously and personally, I feel like we have a very specific responsibility to those communities that we work and live in. And when you think about public service, that's entirely what we do. Like the outcomes and outputs that we create directly impact the communities. We're utilizing the services that we help support. So the why was pretty easy. For me, I mean, it's different, but in a lot of cases, there's a lot of similarities. So I guess what I would say is I've been with government now for about just over a year and a half. And it's been great. There's nuance and differences for sure, no question. But incredible opportunity. I think that's the big piece is you can really make a difference. And again, back to what it is that a public service individual does is they serve their communities.
Of course. Do you miss banking?
I do. I do miss a lot of the, I was a little bit of a personal finance nerd. Some of the previous projects I got to work on were very tech-based. So that's, as you know, my mentality is very much like, how do we operate a tech company in some
Of course, I know that.
And so I was lucky enough to help work with teams and be part of teams that were building, again, based off of finances, but giving back to the community. So, I think there are components I miss, but I bring a lot of those components to the work we do every day.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much. So, right into big data and small data, as they call it, right? Where I come from, there's this rhetoric amongst public servants or politicians that governments must make data-driven policies. Governments must rely on data, even though we do not have as much comprehensive data as we ought to have in Africa, for example. But we want to make, or governments want to make decisions as regards the people using data. You are a data person. You are huge on tech and big and small data. In layman terms, right? Do you think data alone is enough to make governmental decisions? And I ask this because some academics would say that it all starts and ends with data. Before you can make anything at all, you need to conduct a survey, let people, knowing the people's needs should be data driven. However, some persons say data alone should not be. Data is just numbers. People are humans. You should talk to them directly. Now, for an average person, for anyone, for prospective politicians that would watch this, for students that are coming into the public service, for example, data-driven public policy, for example, is that enough for government to make decisions?
So I'm going to break that question into kind of three, right? And so like in my mind, like the first question around like data and data-informed decisions, what I think about when I think of that is like there's a certain, again, not every decision is the same. So I would agree with the statement around like it kind of begins and ends with data because you start kind of analyzing problems and understanding, okay, well, what do we know about a problem? Whatever that problem is, whether it's policy or how to tackle, anything, right? So if you have data, you want to understand how that helps inform your current state. You also use data at the end to describe why you think we should go a specific direction. So that's the informed part. And I think the nuance is in the middle. And so you want to have as much quality data as you can to inform the analytics that goes into the decision. And I think where people get a little, stuck is in a bit of a black and white kind of thing where it's just like, it's all data or no data. And like, what about my gut, right? Like, I don't know, right? And I'm also a big sports and athletics individual.
I know that. You need to see Chris's cubicle. Plaques of basketballers. And he's one of the few Canadians that love real football. Apologies to anybody watching. He loves football, and in fact, Kris had to create a group for us to follow the Euro Cup and all of that. But coming back to your point.
Yeah, and I think when I think of sports, like analytics has gotten so deep in there, and they have, and I think we'll touch on it later around budgets and money to spend on things like, those types of things. But to me, I think sometimes you see sports decisions get made with too much reliance on the analytics. And so there is this middle ground of anywhere like within sports or business or public policy, which is you want to have the most information you can have that's of quality sourced information, and the analytics that you put on it, you want it to be non-biased so that then you can inform, I guess what I would like to call the machines, inform the decision makers that are the humans to then make those decisions, whether it's policy or projects or something like that. So is there a perfect percentage? Like 70% is data, 30% is humans? Probably not. But I do think that there's opportunity when I think of the public service to raise our skills and abilities around that data and analytics component for sure.
Awesome. So when for example, policies fail, not budgets now, when policies fail, do you think there's a gap that, or on whose door would you place some of the basic faults? Like when you look at it from the analytic point of view, for example, when government says it wants to provide shelters and then they go to build shelters that can take half of the people that are homeless, for example, what would you blame? What would you blame that on? Is it their inability to maybe analyze properly or get the numbers perfectly, or just lack of political will?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the broad answer is probably all of the above in some varying way. But what I would offer is, I do think some of those complex problems have very challenging sources of information. So like if you use like, housing, shelter type analysis, it's very challenging. If you read any, scholarly articles that say it's very hard to actually fully estimate the extent of some of the homeless challenges that various locations have. That said, I do think there's an opportunity to help better understand that with cross-government analysis. So there's obviously some challenges, and every government's a little different, but, again, between, the data that exists in each ministerial delivery area or program delivery or something like that, there's probably more data that we can unearth. Now, where you're kind of veering into is the depths of how is the data stored? How is it consistent? The cleanliness of it, the consistency, the reliability, right? And so I think those are where government has potential opportunity to, increase that, which then will help, like we talked about, fuel better analytical decisions.
Yes.
So I think, from my observation, at least in the realms that we work in, and again, we work on infrastructure projects for all governments.
Yes.
So I think that is definitely improving, but, and there's definitely, I think you mentioned earlier too, a will. Is it a will?
Political will,
yeah, I think there definitely is. I think like any other budgetary decision, it's trade-offs.
Yes.
And trade-offs are tough.
Very tough.
It's like we only have so much cash
so
to
much
go
resources,
into this.
Limited resources, so much problems to fix. So the trade-offs are tough, actually.
And that's where I think, at least in my perspective, and again, I don't know, this is just a personal perspective, but like that's why I think our team has been particularly successful, is we've taken a bit of that like scrappy startup, let's build with what we have and those kinds of things. And so I think, for us, we're able to demonstrate some of those values and benefits from taking that approach. It does kind of put us in a position where sometimes we have to be okay with what we have is what we have.
We just have to deal with that. Right?
We've had that conversation before, right? And so it's a fun challenge though, because again, the data's there.
Yeah.
So, and I guess the last thing I would say on the question specific to policy is interesting in that, and again, I'm sure it exists out in the world in various, obviously the world's a big place, but, we write policies a certain way to deliver certain outcomes, right?
Okay.
And so I think where maybe there's an opportunity is, how do we then define, maybe even within the policy, how we measure that success, right? And I think that's verbalized and demonstrated, and there's certainly like it exists.
Yeah.
But how do we better, again, measure that with data to inform the analytics that inform the next decision?
Awesome. I love the way you broke that down. And now I'm gonna go straight. We'll come back there, but I want to go straight into a personal question. Actually, this question is from one of us. that really learned from you from afar, And I was like, I met the person. I was like, hey, Kris would be on the podcast soon. What question do you want me to ask him? Like, can you ask him this? I'm like, yes, I'm gonna. So the person will be watching, and this would help budding public servants and persons that want to go to in the field of analytics. You're skilled in process mapping, project management. If Kris process map for you, you get the idea right from the beginning to the future state. And the future state is like one of our terms. It's an in-house term. If you don't know, you don't know. So those skills, right? The first question would be, how did you cultivate those skills? And secondly, how has it helped you? How has it served you in your position as a leader, as a director of public support and analytics, and as a manager of men? The skills of process mapping. And how can, I'm sorry I'm layering these questions.
No, that's good.
And how can public servants, how can persons in public service learn? Because for me, I feel process mapping and project management is a skill every public servant should have, even if it's basic. Because I've seen through process mapping, tough policies get solved right on the board. breaking it down from stages and the workflow and all of that. So can you explain in details the need, how you cultivated it, and what it can do, the solution-oriented method of process mapping?
Yeah, I guess for me, how I got to where I am with that kind of thought process, and I think about it in largely everything we do, is practice. No one gets good at anything right out of the box, and so it's trial and error. And some of even today, and I mean, I know you're used to me saying this, is like sometimes I draw really crappy pictures, and eventually we get something that actually makes sense. And sometimes bad ideas or wrong ideas come out, but somebody else can layer on top of those and say like, oh, actually it's like this. And so for me, it's a two-piece thing. It's like, okay, well, let's start getting ideas out and visualize that work. And how you visualize that work is, again, dependent on the problem you're trying to solve. So to your point around complexity, like you can get right down to, like a data flow of information, like cylinders, containers, like the full technological specific maps for sure. And sometimes you just need a whiteboard where you're just drawn on a whiteboard and somebody erases what you wrote and everybody's fueling into it, right? And so, yeah, like I think, for me, it's kind of like a mindset thing where it's just like, well, it's back to visualizing the work so that we can align on where we need to go forward. And then people can then choose for their skill sets, those parts. So a lot of my background resides in like agile project delivery and software delivery. So I take a lot of those components and I, for lack of a better word, download them into kind of how I do all the things that I do. And that's where a lot of the process mapping and visualization comes from. But I think it's also vitally important that when you're doing that it's not just a Kris Wanner sitting in an office room or a meeting room drawing on a board and being like, I solved it. Like, in the movies, the guy or girl runs out and they're waving a piece of paper. It's like, I got it, I solved the thing. It's like, that's not how that works. Like everybody has a role to play in complex problems.
Teamwork.
Exactly. And so, yeah, like I think, to the component of the question about leading individuals and groups and teams, I think part of that is a leader's responsibility is to have, it's our job to engage the people that we've hired because we've hired them for reasons that they have skills or knowledge or abilities. And if you're not doing that, what are you doing kind of thing, right? So yeah, like I think it becomes, and sometimes you have to like, again, rely on the most knowledgeable person in the room about the specific piece. And so for me, again, back to coming into government, I don't know all of the government systems. I don't certainly not know how everything works because the machine is so big, but I'm open to how that change can occur. And well, if somebody's going to tell me something new that I don't know and it's valid, well, then let's adjust.
Of course.
Right. And so I think back to your, again, question around like process mapping and the key components of that is those documents are never done. I think that's the thing that I don't know if a lot of people think this way anymore. I think it's shifted a lot, but it's like, oh, okay, well, we're going to build a thing and then we're going to show it and we're like, yay, it's done. And everyone's like, yeah. And we're going to put it on the shelf and we'll look at it again in a year, 5 years, maybe never, right? Like it's done. We're back. That's not how it works. Stuff changes too much, right? And so you kind of almost need those things, especially to be living documents. And again, if complexity gets layered onto what you're doing, you need to create space for that complexity to come into the system. So yeah, I guess to sum that all up, it's just, I think it's a mindset that you place into individuals that then becomes how they kind of operate and break down problems. And hopefully that gives them some skills as they move along in their careers to then become, like I like to call them problem-solving leaders, right? So, yeah. And
I love the point where you said, be open to change. Documents don't die. Let them leave. Like I get that. I get that, Rema, and I'm gonna write that down. And also, majorly, right? I'm from Africa. Just like some of your friends in the ministry.
Yes.
And one major problem governments in Africa has is year in, year out, their budgets fail. Governmental budgets just don't work. Or if they work, they are not implemented to their full term. Also, while first worlds like Canada, maybe you might not say their governments, their budgets fail, but most of them, the implementations are not at 100%, especially as regards policy. From a banker's point of view, from an analytical person's point of view. So you've experienced both worlds. Why do you think governmental budgets fail?
Yeah, and so this question, like the commentary around failure itself is always interesting to me. And what I mean by that is so again, when I think of this question, it's like, okay, why do budgets, or why do projects, or why does something fail? And so I think very often in these situations, we know what success looks like, right? Like a budget success is we've implemented it, we've said what we're going to do, we reached it on time, we've done exactly what we said, we're done, we're good, right? But what we don't talk about is like, what does failure actually look like? And so again, there's very clear things you could outline, like align on what failure is. But when a project gets 70% of the way, or it gets up against a timeline and people have to make decisions about scaling, or day one versus day two, or if you're in an agile kind of component, it's like, what's the first thing we can put out and then build iteratively, all of those things. Failure rarely gets defined, which then becomes a zone of things that is I'd say more objective. And so what I would define as a failure becomes different from yours or someone else's or a C-suite executive.
There's a consensus on success, but none on failure.
Yeah, usually. I mean, it might exist that I don't know about, but I mean, again, it becomes, to me, we focus on like budget. We know how much we have to spend because that gets approved and here's what you get to do. And 99.9% of the time, this is what you're saying you're going to do in this amount of time with this amount of budget, right? Like time scope, budget, all that stuff. But what we don't kind of talk about is, okay, like for failure, like what is failure? Like it doesn't get implemented at all. We don't get anything built. Or is it, well, we need to reach this level of functionality? Because again, back to your previous question, most of these things are never done.
Yeah.
Right? Like even an infrastructure project, you build an urgent care center, say, for example, it will need renovations in the future,
course.
but we consider that different and separate. But again, did it meet the timeline? Did it meet these things? So I guess back again to this question around like, you were talking about Africa and their budgets and those things. I guess for me, my thought process there, and again, for me, I did a little bit of research around this one because again, I'm not hyper familiar, but my understanding is really that, we're dealing with, again, lack of budgets, systems that don't necessarily facilitate, the employment and the contracting, right? Like there's different challenges that exist there. Yeah. Exactly. So while there's very different components there, I think there is perhaps an opportunity for people to consider, okay, like when we're going into approving these budgets for projects or for policies or whatever programs it looks like, what is that line of like, okay, this was not going to be what we think we should be able to get to. And we have a goal. The goal is on time, on budget, done, right? So where do we align in here that it becomes failure or not? So, I mean, a complete lack of implementation, I mean, that's a challenge that is more, it probably requires more analysis, right? Why did that happen?
Of course, because you're an analytical kind of person, so it's not surprising that you go straight into analysis. And majorly, one takeaway from this again is picturing success, but not picturing failure. Is when you picture failure that you know how to fix it.
Yeah.
So that speaks to that. And thank you for that. Yeah. Thank you for that.
You had me think of one more thing too, is like, where do we leave space for in projects and like implementations and administering budgets in learning what we learn over the course of doing the thing we're doing, right? Because you can, you can lay out, you can have the most best information in your hands. You can, be like, we've done this thing 10 times for this amount and it took this long. And you could be like, we know this within X percent. But something can happen. I mean, how many years ago? But hey, global pandemic,
COVID, yeah.
right? Like stuff happens.
Yes.
But how do we leave space for when
that?
Things that, and again, projects do this. People would probably be like, well, we do this. We have it called contingency. Like, yes, but like within the definition, back to your point of success and failure, what is the success and failure contingency? We have the financial contingencies. So I don't know. Haven't fully fleshed that thought out.
No,
but
awesome.
That's
I
what
think
I'm
it's something I personally would like to look into personally from here. What does failure look like in your projects? I've never had anyone ask me that. Even with life's goals, what if you fail? What are your plans if you fail? I think, thank you very much. That's insightful. Also, I want to veer a little into fintech innovations. You're a tech person. So, and the ethical innovation surrounding that. Again, one of the people on your team, we were arguing one day and we feel like data storage, global data storage. We have like some giant corporations, about 5 of them, that are in charge of world global data analytics or storage. Now, for you, when government uses fintech innovations like AI, there are ethical challenges surrounding that. As a data person, or as an intending data person, what are the ethical things that one should watch out for? Because now you're dealing with numbers that can decide people's lives, because it goes directly to you informing government to make right decisions. If you make the wrong decisions relying on fintech innovations, the spiral error would go to government. What are the checks you think personally you put in check, and what maybe younger persons that are in government into the field can actually watch out for?
Yeah, super timely question. I was reading an article this morning that the federal government just announced that they are going to be exploring different ways with fintech companies and third parties around AI and storage and all of these things here in Canada.
Wow.
And so I think, so to the point of your question, like, I think it's kind of like a little bit of an undiscovered country, right? Is like there's potential there, and like there's abilities for governments to partner with fintechs and with some of the biggest companies in the world to facilitate things that government in and of itself can't afford based on budgets or technology and all those things to do. So I guess to me, I think when I think of that, I just think of like, it's going to be really interesting to find out.
Very interesting.
Because we have to, as governments, whether it's federal or provincial or municipal, like we don't have the abilities and the resources, and that's okay to do everything in-house. But I think what we need to be starting to think about, which it sounds like, again, everyone really is like, well, how does this look? How do we do this in a way that is safe for people? Because you're right, like something our team talks about all the time, and again, I know you've heard me say it, is like, we are the arbiters of this information.
Yes.
We need to like ensure that it's, it's the vault, it's safe. Again, we could probably spend tons of time talking about, the fraudsters and all those ones of the world where they always feels like they're one step ahead. And they're always going to be trying to get in there, right? To get that information to, obviously exploit it. But I guess for me, I think about, what are the things that we can do in-house to do that? So you talked about like, an aspiring student or an employee or any of those things. It's like, we just need to be cognizant of those things and how we utilize those tools. And then again, like when it comes to the internal data and the I'd say the innovations that we're building, we just need to make sure that we're working with our IT teams to make sure that those things are protected. And then, again, for the individuals that are really working on the future and what those fintech type agreements even look like. I haven't, and again, I'm not super close to it in government. I was closer to it with my previous role. Okay. Those agreements exist in the private world.
Okay.
right? Where again, you talk about financial information and the similarities between finance and government. They're heavily regulated, right? Like they have some of the most stringent regulations around privacy, security, and all those things for banking information. Because again, as we know, that's real money, right?
Yes,
like
yes,
that's real
people's
money.
Yeah.
So what's interesting is maybe there's something we can learn there from how some of those have worked. Obviously, that's always challenging within a public service and procurement process. But I think as long as it's open and transparent and kind of out there for people to consume as to why we're doing it, it would be fallacy to just ignore it, in my mind.
Yeah, I think it was a fallacy to ignore it too. And to spring off from that, I'm going to ask this common question that I think you would have been asked. Do you think in the area of data analytics and tech, do you think AI is really going to reduce jobs in your field?
Great question. Short answer, it will change jobs.
In what ways?
Well, I guess in my mind, I think what we're going to see is a change in how people work. And so will it replace some of the duties that some people do over time? I'd say most likely. But that doesn't mean that it's bad. It just means that it's different. And so I think the right type of leaders will look at where we're going and what we're doing and how our business is shifting. And there's more than enough space. And I've seen it personally, even over, and again, I'm not that old, but I'm old enough that you've seen, we've seen people's roles, like, and again, to use finance as an example, like the advent of online banking. Like we don't even think twice about that nowadays. You couldn't do anything, never mind on your phone, on a computer, like transfer funds, You had to go into the bank. You had to write a check.
Yes.
And people said at the time, it's like, oh my gosh, like
people are going to lose their jobs.
We're going to lose the tellers. The tellers are going to go away. And have they reduced? Yes. But what that has meant is there's been a shift, and actually in that situation into more technical financial support and advice. So you've gone from a transactional piece, like essentially copying numbers and hitting send, to giving advice. And I think, so when I think as your question relates to what we do, for example, yeah, there probably will be less individuals entering data or copying data or the like initially, but those roles can turn into something completely different that still facilitates the human interaction that needs to come with the artificial creation.
Of course. And also I'm sorry, I'm talking too much about this.
Good.
Do you think that AI, for example, and all these fintech innovations in analytics would enforce or encourage transparency? Looking at the fact that data can also be manipulated to favor a certain narrative. So do you think it will entrench transparency more than we have now or not? And also, do you think that even if it encourages transparency, do you think it can be manipulated to suit a narrative in any way?
I guess two-part answer. So shortest of answers is actually like, yes, absolutely, it can be manipulated. But again, what it comes back to is if you're manipulating the source, then you're not changing the narrative, you're changing what happened. And that's not the same as the story it's telling.
Yes.
So yes, you can absolutely change the narrative or the story, or as some might say, like, oh, well, those analytics are pointing to this. And that can be true and possible. And I think in a lot of ways, people do that every day.
Yes. Yes.
But what I would say is, like, at its core, changing the core data itself, like that'd be like me going in and changing and adding a zero to my bank account. Like that's fraud, right?
Yes,
like that's not the same thing. But for me to look at my spending, for example, and using a personal finance example, but like, you can look at your analysis of how you spent your money and you can analyze it and fit your narrative, right? So I guess where I see the opportunity is in the analysis part. So that's where I think the transparency piece that you asked about becomes more prevalent. I don't think it'll get more transparent to the core, because core data with no analysis or explanation or story or context, that's where it becomes a little less useful.
Yes.
So at its core, it's about confidence in the core data, then gives you confidence in the analysis. And so again, I think there'll always be this layer of, okay, how true is that? And we'll all continue. That's where reputation comes into play.
Of course,
and
morality.
so if you have a reputation of, this is our core data, this is what it is, we are confident in it, this is our analytics, this is why we're confident in it, and then this is what we're recommending, the recommendation out here at the end becomes the narrative, and it becomes, well, how the public consumes that information is then dependent on all of the stuff that happened before.
Awesome. Thank you so very much for sharing your insight, Kris. And there's this last question that we just introduced into the podcast, and I find it insightful because most of my mentors that do not know me, but I know them through maybe their books or what they put out there. And so I decided to ask every of our guests on what's that book that they would recommend any day, anytime, that probably changed their life, their career perspective, their family life, changed them into what they are now. And why I want to start with you specifically is because some of us love what you do. Like seeing you do these things with ease, There might be things that you have, like you said, you learned, you put yourself to study and you practiced over time. What is that book that you refer to any day, anytime? For example, mine is The Alchemist by Paul Coelho, and I even told one of our colleagues at work about it. But for you, what is that book?
So this is a great question, but for me, I find myself to be a collection of many things, which I'm sure that's not foreign to anybody. But when I think of how I've come to become what I am and have, I guess, the mindset that I am, I would recommend probably, I think of like 3 different books, and there's three different types of styles of books. So again, one that I'm sure many already know is like Start With Why, Simon Sinek. I am I like his teachings for like mindset, thought process, inside out, like the human components of things in leadership. And I think everybody should read between Starts With Why and Leaders Eat Last, like those two themselves. And I know those are now considered probably older books, which is interesting. But they are ones that if you're really looking at
evergreen, the lessons are span through generations.
That's a great way to put it. They're evergreen. I like that. I'm going to steal that. But yeah, like I think like at the core of leadership and who and what and how we are, and the responsibility of leaders to build better leaders, and that's what a mentor said to me once, and I use it all the time, is that particular individual for those things is really key. He doesn't write as many books as he has podcasts, but he has a book called Tribe of Mentors. Again, a little bit of an older book, is Tim Ferriss. So he's a very cool and very interesting podcaster who does a lot of these type of things. But he spoke to a massive array of people. He continues to do. Tribe of Mentors I go back to because it's snippets of his. I got to remember, I think it's about 250 different interviews. Asking very different questions about failure and favorite books. You would love it. But many business lessons along the way in there. And what's like, for example, some of his questions he asked, which is great, is like, what's the worst advice you've ever got? And you should ignore kind of stuff. And the reason I like it is he gets very different perspectives from very different people. That's another one. And then it's more sports related, but it's called The Captain Class. And I recommend it all the time. It's actually a book, and you can always tell a good book by if the binding has come off the paper, And again, it's a bit of a leadership, but it's a bit of
I know. I think you've recommended it somewhere, like you wrote. I remember that book. It's down in your cubicle. Or
it is.
I have. I think I've seen it.
And again, it's a little bit more of a leadership. I mean, for me, it's the behaviors of what you want to see, not only in a leadership role, but in the components of a team, whether you're doing, public service, whether you're doing corporations, whatever you're doing, it's true of all the behaviors you'd like to see. And it talks about how there's the vital component of captains in every team, whether they're the actual captains of the sports team or not, but the captain isn't always the best player. And that isn't just a narrative that is true all the time. That is true sometimes and true not. But it's about who's exhibiting what, and then you can start to see those behaviors in people within your team. And I think of that as our team all the time.
Yes.
And I guess for me, when I think of tech, I think, frankly, I guess the most recent book is The Geek Way. It's really cool because it's written by a number of different tech company startups.
Wow.
So it's very cool, again, just around culture and process. For me, if you're talking about like, how do I stay up to date on tech? That moves so fast. That's less of a book thing and more of a like podcast, articles, like that kind of stuff. Cause like you could write a book and go through the process of getting it edited and all that stuff. And by the time you put it out there, unless it's looking backwards, it's really hard to make them look forwards. So
Awesome.
hope those help.
Yeah, they will help. In fact, one thing I'll do, or one thing we'll do when we edit this, is put the pictures of those books while you speak. Also,
sure.
I'm supposed to end this now, but one last question. Kris, would you ever write a book?
I don't know. I mean, it'd be a fun exercise.
I think you should.
Well, hey, if I ever do, I know who I'm working with to help me get my thoughts
I
out.
really
So
think
how
you
about that?
should. Thank you so very much for coming. Thank you so very much for coming. And thank you so much for staying with us. It's been the Civic Policy Archive. I'm Olubumi, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.